There is a widespread perception that warfare is a masculine art. Psychologist Greg Murray found that preference for a male national leader increased from 83% to 94% when a country goes from a condition of peace to a condition of war. It is also known that to the aggressor goes the spoils, and as historian Noah Harari reveals, hundreds of generations of human breeding have produced ultra-violent and aggressive men. This occurs because men are biologically designed to compete for women in order to reproduce. Since an individual's chances of reproduction used to depend on his ability to outperform and defeat other men, the masculine genes that made it to the next generation often belonged to the most ambitious, aggressive, and competitive men. Women, on the other hand, needed a man to care for her during the vulnerable portions of pregnancy and early motherhood. Over long periods of time, the feminine genes that made it to the next generation belonged to women who tended to be submissive caretakers. Prior to the 20th century, it was only men who went off to war, utilizing their muscles to clobber across the ideas of their leaders, nearly all of whom were also male. Historian Victoria Bartels found that the trappings of violence were embedded into the culture of the 16th century Europe, which directly connected the concepts of manliness and violence. Despite this, Professor Owen Drula-Dubé and S.P. Harris found that countries led by queens participated in war more than nations led by kings. Moreover, aggressive participation varied by marital status. Single queens were attacked more than single kings. However, married queens went on the offensive more than lawfully wedded kings. Women have historically been seen as the fairer sex, yet the numbers make it clear that no one should mess with Mama Bear. Elizabeth I is considered to be one of, if not the greatest, ruler in England's history. Incredibly, a huge part of her story lies in the foundations that she established buttressing the rise of the single greatest military power in the world. Due to her shrewd maneuvering, there would come a time when the sun never set upon the British Empire. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series is about England's greatest monarch, Elizabeth I, episode number 7, A Militant Woman. As an unknown quantity, Elizabeth was feared on the international stage. The religious wars of Luther's Reformation raged throughout Europe, and England was the largest and most powerful Protestant state. Although King Henry had remained on the defensive after receiving his excommunication from the Pope, Elizabeth had been aggressively sending signals of support to the Protestants in Scotland, France, and the Netherlands. Placing herself in the position of the primary protector of the faith, her struggles with the French-supported Catholic ruler of the Scots, Mary Stuart, happened in part to ensure that the Protestant people of Scotland weren't forced back beneath the yoke of the Vatican. Lord Dudley, Elizabeth's personal lapdog, urged the Queen to take advantage of the unrest in France caused by the Protestant Huguenots. It would be a chance to regain their landholdings in Calais, support the cause of Protestantism, and offer him a chance to don a suit of armor and win a victory in her name, perhaps even convincing her that he was worthy of marriage. She committed 6,000 troops, landing them in New Haven, despite her Privy Council being split on the soundness of her decision to actively interfere in a war zone. Possessing the stubborn determination of her father, she told the dissenting members of her council that if they were so much afraid that the consequences of failure would fall upon them, she herself would take all the risk and sign her name to it. She cloaked her war intentions under the guise of a humanitarian mission, declaring that her forces were only in Normandy to protect its people, distant relatives of the English. This justification, noble as it may be, has been echoed by despots throughout history, from Hitler to Stalin and Vladimir Putin. The Queen contracted smallpox in the midst of the campaign. Despite the fact that Europeans had built up immunity to the disease, the virus was still a terrifying threat, and Elizabeth temporarily lost her ability to speak. The doctors were certain that her time had come, even going as far as to wrap her and lay her upon a pallet by the fire in preparation for her cremation. Yet, just 2 hours later, an unexpected twist. She regained her voice and began a steady recovery. For 10 long days, England had held its breath, fearing for the Queen's life, and in those moments of uncertainty, the kingdom had been forced to confront a terrifying truth. Elizabeth had never established a firm line of succession. Upon her recovery, delirious and weak, her first words were a stunning declaration. Lord Robert Dudley would serve as the Lord Protector of the kingdom. Having recovered, Elizabeth took stock of what was happening in Normandy. What she saw likely made her wish she hadn't miraculously pulled through. England's troops were isolated, and her failure to send them adequate aid had left them in a vulnerable position. The Protestants of Europe, already disgruntled by the lack of support, began to feel betrayed, as it became increasingly clear that Elizabeth was more focused on expanding territory than on rescuing her own people. The situation grew more dire by the day, and eventually the French Protestants struck their own deal with the Catholic government, making it clear that if Elizabeth refused to pull her troops from New Haven, they would unite with the French forces and expel the English from the region once and for all. Thus, her first campaign was an abject failure. Elizabeth had needlessly ruffled the feathers of Catholic France, and to make matters worse, her Protestant allies had turned on her. The financial strain of the campaign forced her to summon Parliament, which took the opportunity to scold her for remaining unmarried and failing to secure a clear line of succession. While her besieged forces stubbornly held on in New Haven, the situation in France deteriorated rapidly. The plague broke out, claiming the lives of 60 soldiers each day. Eventually, the exhausted troops were forced to independently accept terms of surrender. To add insult to injury, the returning soldiers brought the plague back to England with them. London was soon overwhelmed by the disease, which claimed the lives of 21,000. Historian Anne Somerset reveals that the Queen took her setback in France squarely. She accepted that the responsibility of the venture was hers alone and did not try to blame Dudley for having goaded her into a futile action. The episode had also taught her a lesson which she never forgot. The bond of a shared faith was not strong enough to override nationalist sentiment. Having burnt her fingers so badly in France, Elizabeth acquired a lifelong distrust of reckless forays on the continent. From here on out, she would deal patiently with incidents that could lead in open warfare. she managed to stall a war in Scotland by securing control over Mary, Queen of Scots. The execution of her cousin, however, risked upsetting the delicate balance between competing Christian ideologies. Although she officially required all of her subjects to become Protestant, she ignored punishing any Catholics as long as they were discreet in their violations. It was a dramatic shift from her predecessor, Bloody Mary, who burned 300 Protestants in an attempt to intimidate her subjects into conversion. Despite her leniency, there remained English Catholics who held that they ought to be allowed to openly worship the faith of their choice. Thomas Howard, the influential Duke of Norfolk, was one of the wealthiest and influential English Catholics. He came to the conclusion that, despite despising Mary Stuart, marrying her would eventually lead him to the throne of Scotland. Once there, it was only Elizabeth in the way of utilizing his new wife's bloodline to place the crown of England upon his head. There wasn't anything illegal about his plan, but you can imagine that he didn't want to divulge to Elizabeth herself that he was praying for her demise. The problem was that he needed Elizabeth's permission to wed Mary, who remained a captive of the state. The Queen soon became alerted to rumors of Howard's plan, but it wasn't enough to have him arrested. She had the Duke over for dinner in hopes of teasing out his plan, but the would-be rebel kept his tongue. Despite proof, it began to appear to the Queen's eyes as a conspiracy to bring about her downfall. We aren't sure what she planned to do with him, but Norfolk assumed the worst when she had asked him to again return to court. Panicking, he refused to obey the Queen's order, an act that was tantamount to treason. When allies didn't rally to his cause, he threw himself up upon the mercy of the good Queen Bess. She had the Duke in her clutches, but was yet unsure how many other members of her court sought to see her replaced upon the throne by Mary. Her council encouraged her to do the sensible thing and wait until the dead of winter before calling to court those she suspected of backing the Duke. But she was unwilling to give her enemies any more time to plot her downfall. Although she was reluctant to start a fight, she was more than willing to punch back when her survival was at stake. Somerset tells us that her council had predicted by summoning the earls to court, the Queen precipitated the very unrest she had hoped to forestall. In just 5 days, 300 armed horsemen had assembled with the intention of raising the North against her. The numbers swell from there as the rebelling lords sought to turn their quest for power into a holy war. The Queen maintained her calm, taking Mary southward, away from the rebellion that sought to install her as their Catholic figurehead. Then she diligently raised an army, which, although it was half the size of the rebels, was made up of serious fighting men, each of whom was equipped with proper weapons. The vast majority of the 10,000-man rebel forces were hungry peasants. The delay worked in the Queen's favor, with Somerset informing us that the rebel army was having to live off the country, which forfeited them the sympathy of many local inhabitants. Once face to face with Elizabeth's army, the rebellion melted away, with its leaders fleeing to Scotland. Somerset reveals to us that in the end, the rebellion had proved a pathetic fiasco, and now it only remained for the authorities to enact a grisly retribution. the highest-ranking officials, unable to escape, received the full array of medieval justice, with some being burnt at the stake, while others were hanged. A few were unlucky enough to be disemboweled. The final tally, receiving the Queen's justice, exceeded 700, which hardly satiated Elizabeth, who urged her council to make an even larger example. So much violence was meted out that the Pope excommunicated Elizabeth. But her brutality worked, pacifying the North and ensuring, for the time being, peace in England. Unbeknownst to the Queen, however, were the forces from the Iberian Peninsula that were eyeing her kingdom after she had unwittingly committed strike 2 in the eyes of King Philip II. It's no exaggeration to say that Philip and Elizabeth had a complex history. The King of Spain had been married to Elizabeth's half-sister. Rather than presiding as a king, however, the Spaniard had been humiliatingly consigned to the role of a consort. Although he attempted to have a child with his wife, Mary passed away from influenza before Philip's line could be established. Seeking power and desiring to re-entrench Catholicism upon the British Isles, he had offered to marry Elizabeth, expecting her to be swayed by the resources that he could provide her. She didn't even bother to answer the proposal, leaving the Spanish monarch waiting in the wind for a full 4 weeks. This had been strike 1. Their personal preferences regarding religion were destined to pull them apart, but they had been related to each other via marriage, and their nations were entwined through trade via the Spanish Netherlands. Incredibly, 2/3 of all of England's overseas trade went through Antwerp. Despite this, the two monarchs regularly took small diplomatic swipes at each other, with the Spaniards refusing an audience with the English ambassador over his practice of Protestantism. Things escalated from there, with Spain recalling its easy-to-get-along ambassador and replacing him with Don Guerra, a man described as both a religious bigot and a political incendiary. Somerset tells us that the appointment was a blatant attempt at fomenting a rebellion. The Netherlands were at the heart of the matter. Rather than an ununified state, the Dominion of Spain was a loose confederation of 17 provinces. Spain's grip upon the United Provinces was tenuous. Philip's insistence in exporting the Spanish Inquisition didn't go over well with the land's Protestants, and the Calvinists were at the center of a major nationwide riot, which saw churches sacked and idols destroyed. In response, 10,000 Spanish soldiers arrived to purge key leaders. A new council was set up, one that was quickly nicknamed the Council of Blood, as it was responsible for executing more than 1,000 Protestants. Another 60,000 fled the violence, with many of those finding their way into the protective arms of Queen Elizabeth. The situation reeked of modern-day geopolitics surrounding the United States and the People's Republic of China. While it was religion in the England-Spain feud, the two modern nations split over their forms of government while remaining aligned due to their economies. The U.S. is the world's greatest buyer, and China is the world's top seller. If either were to cut themselves off from the other, both would suffer terminal economic decline. Because of this interdependence, Philip resolved to first subjugate the Netherlands before turning his attention to the heretics across the Channel. Meanwhile, Elizabeth remained distracted by the larger threat brought about by the desire to restore her Catholic cousin to the throne of Scotland. There were three main reasons for her obsessive quest. First, she believed that kings and queens should always side with monarchs, meaning that no one should be able to remove them, no matter what. Second, Mary had previously been the Queen of France. Treating her poorly would provide justification for Catholic power to sail across the Channel in an effort to unseat her. Third, Elizabeth believed that by securing Mary's restoration, she could convince her to agree to forever give up her legitimate claim to the English throne. In 1571, however, everyone could see it was a doomed enterprise. Mary had finally caught on to the fact that she was Elizabeth's prisoner and began to seek out allies. Florentine banker Roberto Ridolfi emerged as her best hope. He had arrived at the English court, promising that he could bring about a restoration of trade between England and the Spanish-held Netherlands. In reality, he was a Catholic agent who, after meeting secretly with Mary, took her cause to the courts of Rome, Madrid, and Brussels. King Philip II supported the plot, but wasn't willing to meet Rodolfi's request to dispatch a Spanish army to the shores of England. The Duke of Alva, the man in charge of subduing the Netherlands rebellion, advised that such action would only be acceptable if Elizabeth was already dead or in custody. Upon which the Spanish court began to discuss whether or not they should seek out the Queen's assassination. Somerset lets us into the mind of Philip, revealing to us that Philip replied firmly that Elizabeth was an enemy who would never overlook an opportunity to do him harm, and that the only way to recover control of the Netherlands would be to deprive her of her crown. Elizabeth became aware of plots against her life and accepted some safeguards, such as never accepting gifts of food or perfume from unknown sources. But she was unwilling to change her daily routine, no matter the level of danger. The worsening situation, however, did cause her to seriously reconsider her pledge to remain unmarried. She went to the French court in hopes to secure an alliance against the Spanish. Despite their shared faith, the French and the Spanish viewed each other as their chief rival. An alliance with the English would be enough to ward off Spain's provocations along their southern border. Negotiations soon began for the hand of Catherine de' Medici's middle son, the Duke of Anjou. There were a couple of problems with the match. First, the age difference, with Elizabeth having already reached the age of 37, while the French Dauphin was just 19. Second was the fact that the French teen was already widely known to have homosexual tendencies. In today's world, he would be understood to be a transvestite. He was also very loose with his morals, having been publicly linked to members of both genders. Third, he, like all French royals, was Catholic. It was this last issue that ultimately prevented an agreement from being reached. Although Elizabeth had originally been informed that the Duke's religious beliefs were malleable, the Frenchman suddenly experienced a religious conversion that saw him attending 2 or 3 masses a day. In all likelihood, the young Frenchman used his faith to avoid marrying the 37-year-old virgin queen. In what had to have been a projection of his own concerns, he begged his mother to not force him to marry such an immoral woman. As the negotiations fell apart, Elizabeth became aware that Rodolphe's plot had gained the support of at least one member of her court. Ciphered letters had been intercepted telling of a plot to place Mary upon the throne of England with the aid of a man identified only by the number 40. The torturers at the Tower of London worked overtime to figure out who it was, only discovering the Duke of Norfolk via an accounting error. You may recall from previous episodes that the Duke of Norfolk spent some time in the tower after seeking Mary, Queen of Scots' hand without first notifying Elizabeth. He had been forced to pay some hefty fines in order to keep his head. Failing to learn from the experience, he joined the Rodolphe plot, becoming implicated after an unsuspecting merchant was contracted to pass along funds to a co-conspirator. The courier, however, realized that his load was heavier than it should have been, investigated, and reported to the royal court his discovery of more than 500 pounds of gold and several letters in code. He was found guilty by 26 of his peers and sentenced to be executed upon the Tower Green. There was more than enough evidence to subject Mary to the same fate, but Elizabeth still refused to behead a fellow monarch. 3 times she signed the order to execute her treasonous cousin, only to change her mind the next day. To help break the impasse, she called Parliament to session, pushing forth 2 laws that they believed would help her feel better about what needed to be done. The first course of action, far more popular among the members of Parliament, was to officially identify Mary as the killer of her husband, an adulteress, an enemy to England, a traitor to the Queen, and a subverter to the state. If that was rejected, however, a more moderate measure was written up. Upon its passage, Mary would lose all claim to the English throne, and the Duke would be executed in her place. Elizabeth favored the latter, and Thomas Howard finally lost his head. While it would have been preferable to eliminate the Queen of Scots, it was believed by members of Parliament striking off Norfolk's head shall be at least half the cutting of her neck. Despite pulling the trigger on her co-conspirator, Elizabeth failed to sign the accord that would have disinherited Mary from the English throne. Despite having long pursued such an outcome, the Queen was a habitual procrastinator. Mary's continued inclusion in the line of succession only intensified fears that the Spanish might seek to assassinate Elizabeth. She reopened marriage negotiations for the French Duke of Anjou, conceding her long-standing condition that any prospective husband must forego practicing Catholicism in private. It wasn't enough, however. Catherine de' Medici, the French Queen Mother, was forced to admit that she lacked the authority to compel Anjou to accept the proposal. Somerset tells us that Elizabeth must have felt relief informing us that in the aftermath of the plot, it had been difficult for her to resist the pressure of those who urged her into the patriotic duty to link herself with a powerful protector. But her temperamental aversion to marriage had remained as violent as ever. Knowing, however, that Anjou was singularly uninspired by the prospect of matching himself to her, she had calculated that in all probability he would decline her hand even if it was extended to him on the most generous of terms. The gamble had paid off magnificently. By making an improved offer to Anjou, Elizabeth had signaled that she was serious about marriage, and when he declared it unacceptable, all the onus of the rejection had fallen on the French. The Queen was now able to assume the guise of injured maidenhood. In martyred tones, she declared that since her attempts to find herself a husband had caused her to be so ill-used, she hoped that her subjects would now understand why it was that she preferred to live unmarried. Unfortunately, the ploy worked a little too well. The French queen now proposed her youngest son, the 16-year-old Duke of Alençon. Aware of her son's sexual preferences, she declared to Elizabeth that a marriage to this prince would be 10,000 times better than the last. Initially, Elizabeth seemed to prefer the idea. The Duke of Alençon had been christened Hercules at birth until it became apparent he was extremely short and utterly lacking in muscle. Surviving 2 bouts of smallpox had done little to improve his appearance. Somerset tells us that Elizabeth grew increasingly disturbed by the absurdity of marrying a juvenile pock-marked midget. The growing Spanish threat and the progress of marriage negotiations led to the signing of the Treaty of Blois on April 19, 1572. It was a mutual defense pact. If either nation were attacked, the other would come to its aid. Both France and England mistakenly believed it would be enough to deter Spain. But not everyone was convinced. One of Elizabeth's top advisors proposed a preemptive strike, a surprise attack on Spanish forces in the Netherlands. This would not only catch Philip's troops off guard, but it also broadcast to Europe that Protestants had a protector willing to fight. The idea found support among courtiers who believed the war with Spain was inevitable. Elizabeth, however, believed the conflict could still be avoided. Yet, something had to be done. The Protestant Dutch were being systematically slaughtered by their Spanish overlords. The need for action became urgent when France announced it was prepared to send a sizable force into the Netherlands. Despite the alliance, Elizabeth could not stomach the idea of her ancient enemy controlling the region. Seeking to forestall French efforts while maintaining deniability, she authorized 1,000 Englishmen to quietly join the rebellion. When the Spanish ambassador lodged an official complaint, Elizabeth claimed ignorance of their departure. What followed might have been prevented had Elizabeth and Catherine trusted one another. The Queen Mother opposed her son's military involvement in the Netherlands, fearing it would provoke Spain into declaring war against France. She also suspected that Elizabeth would use the chaos as an excuse to renege on their mutual defense pact, letting the two Catholic powers weaken each other before launching her own cross-channel invasion. Medici is well regarded as one of the most formidable female figures in history. She blamed her son's actions upon the advice of Admiral Coligny, the leader of the French Protestants. Coligny had cornered the king, warning him in blunt terms that failure to support the Dutch Protestants would prove the crown's promises of religious tolerance hollow. potentially reigniting civil war. Seeking to eliminate the Protestant threat at its roots, Catherine ordered Coligny's assassination, but he survived the attempt, forcing her to escalate. She lied to her son about the supposed Protestant conspiracy to overthrow him. Enraged, he gave her permission to proceed with what would become the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. The plan had been to quietly kill the French troublemaker and a few key Protestant leaders during a royal wedding between Catherine's daughter to Henry of Navarre, a prominent Huguenot. Instead, it devolved into an orgy of violence. The bloodshed spread throughout France. Somewhere between 30,000 and 70,000 Protestants were killed. Elizabeth's advisor, who advocated for a first strike, barely escaped Paris. The horrors he witnessed convinced him that the long-foretold biblical Armageddon was at hand, one that would sweep across Europe. Still, he could not persuade Elizabeth to act decisively. Throughout these early phases of her Cold War with Philip, Elizabeth displayed traits often unfairly attributed to female rulers. As mentioned earlier, she was a chronic procrastinator who frequently changed her mind. Her flip-flopping in foreign policy bred distrust, as evidenced by France's suspicion that she would abandon the Treaty of Blois. Her inquiries about Mary, Queen of Scots, had fixated on the woman's looks rather than her intentions, suggesting a vanity that felt at odds with a monarch who claimed to be married only to her country. At times, she acted against England's interests simply to spite her enemies. She forfeited £4,000 annually in trade after placing an embargo on Spanish goods, a response to Spain's tariffs, which in turn had been imposed after English pirates seized Spanish treasure ships forced to harbor in England. She could be petty, especially regarding class distinctions. Part of her reluctance to aid the Dutch was rooted in disdain. Outside of William of Orange, the Protestant leadership was largely made up of peasants. She once muttered that she disliked colluding with a rabble of shoemakers, carpenters, and heretics. Her temper was infamous. Courtiers regularly tiptoed around her moods. At her worst, she physically assaulted her ladies-in-waiting and threatened to hang trusted advisors who offered unwelcome news. The fact that she rarely followed through didn't make serving her any less nerve-wracking. Monarchs' spending habits are always scrutinized, but female rulers, they're judged more harshly. History is more likely to remember the Marie Antoinettes, who spent recklessly, than the Elizabeths, who carefully managed their budgets. Elizabeth took in approximately £200,000 annually. By reducing her household expenses to £135,000, she created a large surplus. Early in her reign, that surplus went to paying off the £228,000 debt left by her half-sister and upgrading England's defenses. By the time Spanish provocations intensified, she was banking £50,000 annually. Her critics expected her to use this reserve to plunge into Europe's religious wars, launching aggressive campaigns to defend Protestantism. Instead, she preferred to issue small sums on a case-by-case basis, often refusing to act until the Protestant cause was nearly lost. The fallout from the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was profound. In an attempt to rekindle their fragile alliance, Catherine de' Medici asked Elizabeth to serve as godmother to the French king's daughter, but the wounds were still raw. Elizabeth jokingly replied that it might be difficult to find an Englishman willing to travel to France on her behalf. For the time being, negotiations over the hand of Alençon were suspended. The timing was opportune, as the young prince had landed in jail after plotting to depose his elder brother. When marriage talks resumed, Elizabeth wirily remarked that it was not unreasonable to expect that her future husband would be a free man. Unrelated to his brother's conspiracy, the French king died suddenly in 1574, thrusting the cross-dressing Duke of Anjou onto the throne and plunging Elizabeth into a nightmare scenario: a devout, Catholic French king potentially aligning with Spain against England. Her suspicions deepened when her ambassador reported witnessing the French queen mockingly dress two of her royal dwarfs as Elizabeth and the imprisoned Alençon. Elizabeth briefly considered hiring German mercenaries, but indecision stalled action until the French prince escaped on his own and joined the Huguenot cause. True to form, he switched sides again within 6 months, supporting his brother after the revocation of Protestant worship rites. France descended once more into civil war, with Alençon's committing atrocities against the very Protestants he had just supported. Playing the great game of houses, Elizabeth made a brief overture towards Spain, signing the Treaty of Bristol 3 months after Anjou's accession. She withdrew what little support she had been providing the Netherlands rebels and offered herself as a neutral mediator, hoping to prevent either France or Spain from dominating the region's vital trade ports. But Spain had no interest in compromise. The situation shifted dramatically in 1576 when Spain failed to pay its troops stationed in the Netherlands. The result was a 4-day orgy of violence in Antwerp that left 8,000 citizens dead. The shocking brutality of the Spanish troops finally united the Dutch provinces. Historian Anne Somerset writes, "So long as the provinces were prepared to resist him, there was no possibility that Philip could wield the Low Countries into an absolutist state." This was Elizabeth's moment to decisively intervene, to flood the Netherlands with English forces. Yet, though she distanced herself from Spain, she still refused to act with conviction. When rebel leaders questioned the wisdom of sending 1,000 cavalry during the winter months into a land with no available forage for horses, Elizabeth responded not by correcting the logistics, but by changing her financial assistance from a donation to a loan. She later demanded that the Dutch offer their crown jewels as collateral. Offended, the rebels turned instead to Alençon. Somerset notes, "It was not altogether easy to trust in the Frenchman's assurances, for the Queen was reminded that if he were to drive out the Spaniards from the Netherlands, he might as well wax straight a greater enemy himself." Elizabeth fondly imagined that she could use him as her stalking horse, but several of her advisors still feared he might prove a Trojan horse, seizing the provinces for France. Holding on to that hope, Elizabeth reopened the long-dormant marriage negotiations with France. Now 47 years old, Elizabeth found herself once again courted by the now 26-year-old juvenile pock-marked midget. This time, the French sent the prince's master of the wardrobe, Jean de Semir, to woo the English queen. Though officially tasked with advocating for his lord, Smear proved surprisingly effective in charming Elizabeth himself. The two spent weeks together. Some courtiers even questioned whether Smear had used love potions and unlawful arts to work his way into the queen's affections, for there was no denying that he had swept her completely off her feet. Gifts were exchanged, and soon the French prince himself crossed the channel for an unofficial visit. He was as charming as his envoy, and Elizabeth put on a show for him, dancing with the giddy energy of a teenager, while the Alençon, keen to keep the visit discreet, watched from behind a screen. But Elizabeth was far too cagey, too indecisive to be caught so easily. Had the Frenchmen proposed on the spot, priest in tow, he might have secured a yes. But when negotiations turned to a dowry, the French request for a sizable pension, Elizabeth began to wonder whether the prince wanted her or her money. Though that issue was eventually worked through, another formidable obstacle emerged: the deep-seated xenophobia of the English people. Her half-sister, Queen Mary, faced an uprising for marrying Spanish's king. Now Elizabeth was proposing the same, only with a French man. Her Privy Council was nearly unanimous in declaring it's a terrible idea. Across the country, Puritan preachers denounced the match from their pulpits. One outspoken squire lost his right hand after publishing a scathing pamphlet that decried the suitor was this odd fellow, by birth a Frenchman, by profession a papist, an atheist by conversation, an instrument in France of uncleanness, a fly worker in England for Rome and France, a sorcerer by common voice and fame, who is not fit to look in at Elizabeth's great chamber door. Having resisted marriage for so long, Elizabeth was shocked that her people now opposed it. But the reasoning was simple. They had once hoped marriage would secure the line of succession. But at 47, Elizabeth was unlikely to bear a child. If she did, she might not survive childbirth, leaving England in the hands of a foreign, Catholic regent. Taking off her love goggles, Elizabeth began to see more risks than rewards. Not wanting to alienate the French, she reverted to her signature tactic: delay. She offered neither a yes nor a definitive no, stringing along negotiations. Then came along another affront to Philip of Spain. Strike 3 in their relationship came about due to Elizabeth's involvement with the pirate Francis Drake. Betrayed in the New World by the Spanish admiral, Drake had sought revenge by raiding Spanish ships. In 1577, he set out with Elizabeth's backing on a daring expedition. Meanwhile, France's marriage commissioners arrived to finalize her nuptials. They were stunned when Elizabeth abruptly reversed course. She blamed public outcry, religious differences, the threat of war with Spain, and even the age gap. Yet, when Alençon himself came to press his case, she relented. On October 31st, while strolling in her garden, she declared, "You may write this to the king. The Duke of Alençon shall be my husband." Then she kissed him on the mouth and summoned her court to announce the news, only to again reverse her decision days later by adding impossible conditions. Still, The young prince remained, claiming that he would rather die than leave England without marrying her. Seeing him linger, the queen had her advisors casually mention that if he stayed past January 1st, he would have to get her a New Year's gift. He proceeded to present her with a gorgeous, bejeweled anchor to reveal his unwillingness to move on without her. When that failed to secure a firm marriage date, he finally got the hint, leaving for the Netherlands at the beginning of February. Elizabeth tearfully saw him off while encouraging him to return to her safely. This foray into the Netherlands, however, turned sour quickly and cost him his life. Elizabeth, ever the performer, proclaimed herself a widow. But few were fooled. As the Spanish ambassador observed, she is a princess who knows how to compose and to transform herself as best suits her. Even her own mother remarked, "Would to God you had died young. You would have not then been the cause of the death of so many brave gentlemen." But the Netherlands would cost Elizabeth more than just a failed match. In 1584, her Protestant ally, William of Orange, was assassinated, shot in the stomach and lungs in history's first successful handgun killing. He had once survived a bullet through the neck and cheek. This time, he wasn't so lucky, as his murderer discharged 2 bullets which tore through his lungs and stomach. Both of the hits had been ordered by King Philip of Spain, resulting in William becoming a martyr for the Protestant cause. Although genocide had always been off limits in the era of the divine right of kings, the widening ideology rift between churches had now made Europe's monarchs fair game. With Catholic Mary Queen of Scots still in line for the English throne, Elizabeth became a target. Philip even hinted that assassinating her would be no sin. One friar, caught by Elizabeth's spies, casually remarked that many were eager to kill that wicked woman. The odds of such a thing happening increased the longer England was involved in the ongoing war of subjugation. After William's death, Elizabeth hoped France would intervene. But in 1585, the French king rejected the Dutch offer to make him their monarch. Elizabeth finally accepted that she must act. After 6 weeks of negotiations, she signed another treaty, committing 5,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry at England's expense. She chose her longtime companion, Lord Robert Dudley, to lead the expedition. Though he had been formerly friend-zoned by Elizabeth and nearly thrown into the Tower for marrying without her permission, Dudley managed to claw his way back into her favor. In the interim, he had married for love, but had failed to obtain permission from the Queen. While it wasn't legally required, it was a common courtesy to give her a heads up. Now, back in favor, he took to the Netherlands mission with enthusiasm, overseeing his troops' preparations and informing everyone of the glory that he was going to bring back for the Queen. Everything was great, until Dudley's wife showed up at court to see him off. Despite being in her late 40s, Elizabeth exhibited the jealousy of a schoolgirl, abruptly declaring that she couldn't be parted from her favorite in such a dangerous time. This unexpected delay cost the expedition 5 months. When Dudley finally departed, Elizabeth gave him a watered-down title, Lieutenant general of the Queen's forces, hoping to signal that England sought no conquest. Yet, upon landing, Dudley was greeted with Tudor roses and offered the title of Governor General. He accepted, without her permission. Furious, Elizabeth sent a trusted knight to demand that he relinquish it. A month later, she wanted him demoted, but her council talked her down. Historian Anne Somerset notes, the truth was that Elizabeth's longing for an end to the war had grown so intense that she would have considered peace terms which the Netherland rebels never would have endorsed, including the abandonment of religious freedom. The war, now 18 years in, was draining £134,000 annually. Dudley reported that English troops were unpaid and starved. Unlike domestic conscripts, overseas volunteers had no legal obligation to serve and were responsible for their own supplies. Reinforcements dwindled. Dudley turned to Calvinist extremists, demoralizing the Dutch even further. Then came a personal blow. His nephew was killed in battle, a young man dear to Elizabeth. Unlike the ancient warrior Achilles, whose cousin's death led to glorious vengeance, she was stirred towards disillusionment. Meanwhile, tensions at home boiled over. In 1586, Mary, Queen of Scots, was caught red-handed conspiring with 6 Englishmen to assassinate Elizabeth, timed with the Spanish invasion. We'll explore her role in the conspiracy in the next episode, but for now, know this. Mary, Elizabeth's cousin and heir, was executed in February 1587. True to form, Elizabeth agonized afterward, blaming her council for their irreversible act. The Scots, French, and Spanish were enraged. Philip of Spain seized on the execution as a casus belli, but the plans for his invincible Spanish Armada were already in motion. King Philip had patiently bided his time, following the advice of his war council. Spain must first subdue the rebellion in the Low Countries before turning its religious fervor toward Protestant England. The Pope had urged him to invade as early as 1583. 3 years later, Philip approached the papal successor to secure financing for the venture. England's dispatch of 6,000 troops under Lord Dudley, combined with Francis Drake's pirate raids in the New World, had pushed past the threshold of provocations he was willing to tolerate. Philip's admiral proposed an ambitious plan: assemble a fleet of over 500 ships to transport an army of more than 94,000 men. The Armada would land in Ireland, drawing English forces to defend their vulnerable flank. Once England was entangled there, the Spanish would stage a feigned retreat, sailing past a distracted navy to strike at an undefended English cities. But his lead general rejected the idea. Instead, he claimed he needed only a small, inexpensive flotilla of flat-bottomed barges to cross the English Channel from the Netherlands, under the cover of darkness. Interestingly, both Napoleon and Hitler would later entertain strikingly similar invasion schemes. Rather than choosing between the two, Philip merged them into a dreaded Option C. The fleet would still attack Ireland, while the barges carried troops directly across the Channel. The fatal flaw? The English diversion required England to know it was under threat, while the cross-channel assault depended on complete surprise. The death of Mary, Queen of Scots, solved one complication for Philip. He had long imagined that he, or one of his daughters, might rule England, but Mary, a Catholic heir, would have needed to be placated or removed. Now, with her gone, the Pope gave Philip his blessing to choose England's next monarch, on the condition that Catholicism be restored. To ensure papal financial support, Philip insisted the entire College of Cardinals be informed of the scheme. This backfired spectacularly. The cardinals of Rome, notorious for gossip, leaked the plan. Thus, England learned that Spain was coming, with a massive fleet. In March 1587, Elizabeth dispatched Sir Francis Drake with a small fleet and a carte blanche to disrupt Spanish preparations. She even placed 6 of her own ships under his command, making it impossible to deny royal involvement. As was typical, she had second thoughts, but her letter softening the mission's scope arrived too late. 10 days after setting out, Drake sailed into Cadiz harbor and burned or captured 37 ships. He remained in the area for weeks, operating from a captured fort and targeting supply vessels, specifically those carrying hoops and pipe staves meant to make the casks that would hold food and water for the Armada. Somerset notes that Drake foretold that Philip would have the utmost difficulty replacing these goods, and indeed, when the Armada sailed, its food supplies were stored in casks made of unseasoned timber, with the result that great quantities of food rotted and rapidly became inedible. Drake's audacious strike delayed the Armada by an entire year and became known as the singeing of the king's beard. Historian Oliver Elton captures the swagger and magnetism behind the success. His men adored his spirit and flocked to his ship to serve under his flag. To them, there was something magical, and to the Spaniards, something uncanny in his luck. The English called him Fortune's child, and the Spanish called him the devil. He acted upon the instinct of his genius with a sure and shining faith in himself, which must have been hateful to smaller men. Drake shared in the danger, personally carrying bundles of firewood to the fortress gates while defenders held off the enemy. He returned to Elizabeth's court with flair, presenting her with 2,500 bottles of prized Spanish sherry. As his expeditions were joint stock ventures, the Queen herself earned £40,000 in profit. To make matters worse for the Spanish, they had no idea he had returned. For 2 full months, they scoured their coastlines, convinced Drake was still hiding in one of their harbors. Meanwhile, Elizabeth opened peace talks, providing diplomatic cover while Spain scrambled to revise its strategy. In response to Drake's raid, Philip dropped the requirement that his admiral land first in Ireland. Somerset explains, Philip modified his original plan of action, dropping the requirement that his admiral should land in Ireland prior to his general launching his attack on England itself. With the element of surprise lost, the cross-channel troops would now require the full protection of the Armada itself. Somerset tells us that as 1587 drew to a close, there were many Englishmen who were nervous about what the coming year would bring. Their fears were amplified by ancient prophecies, the most famous of which came from the 15th century mathematician and seer Regiomontanus. His readings of the heavens had led him to predict that in 1588 there would be either a universal consummation and final dissolution of the world, or at least a general subversion and alteration of principalities, kingdoms, monarchs, and empires. Signs abounded that nature itself was in turmoil, confirming for many that some great cataclysm was imminent. One popular story claimed that on the window of the Queen's presence chamber at court, a vast number of fleas had collected together. Another spoke of 30 great dolphins swimming up the river to the Queen's Watergate. That year saw 2 solar eclipses, and Mars dominated the night sky. Given that Mars had long been associated with the god of war, such omens only stoked public anxiety. Despite the looming threat of war, Elizabeth made a final effort to secure peace with Spain. The signs, however, indicated that her efforts were in vain. It took weeks just to decide where negotiations should begin. Then, the Pope excommunicated Elizabeth for a second time, while Cardinal William Allen pushed a book in England urging rebellion against the Queen. He described her as a most unjust usurper, an infamous, deprived, accursed, excommunicate, heretic, the very shame of her sex and princely name, the chief spectacle of sin and abomination in our age, further accusing her of indulging in unspeakable and incredible variety of lust with a number of men of her court. Advised to seek peace but prepare for war, Elizabeth found herself in a difficult position. England's home defenses had been neglected, but her navy was in the best condition it had seen during her reign. This combination made it clear that their best strategy would be to meet the Spanish Armada at sea. Even so, the challenge was daunting. The Queen had only 25 warships. Coastal communities were expected to supply additional vessels, and private ships could be chartered. 11 of her royal ships had recently been modernized thanks to the efforts of John Hawkins, head of the Naval Board. Hawkins had revolutionized English ship design by eliminating the towering castles atop ships, structures meant to protect sailors during boarding actions. The result was a fleet of lower, sleeker vessels with better artillery placement and improved maneuverability. The entire country was ordered to mobilize. Earthen ramparts were constructed, beaches were staked, and beacon networks established to alert defenders of an imminent landing. Carts and horses were kept ready to transport cannons quickly to threatened areas. Mobility, it turned out, would be the key to success. Francis Drake pressed the Queen to strike first, arguing the advantages of time and place in all martial actions is half a victory. He wanted to attack the Armada while it was still in Spanish waters. Though Drake tried to wrest control from the Queen's cousin, he ultimately relented when he realized that the Lord Admiral believed firmly in yielding to the person with greater experience. Elizabeth briefly approved his plan, but soon recalled him, fearing the risk of leaving England undefended. Drake returned quickly, aided by favorable winds, which ironically threatened to blow the Armada past its preferred landing point. Somerset observes, it was just as well that Drake's plan was never put to the test. While strategically sound, Elizabeth's caution was warranted. Philip had ordered his armada not to turn back even if the English were reported off the Spanish coast. Had the two fleets met near Spain, the English may have been at a severe disadvantage. Their ships carried only 20 to 30 rounds of a shot per gun, compared to the Spanish standard of 50. During the actual engagements in the Channel, the English ran low on ammunition after just 2 battles and had to resupply from shore. That wouldn't have been an option in the Spanish waters. When the two sides finally met, the Spanish Armada lived up to its fearsome reputation. Though newly appointed, the Duke of Medina Sidonia proved competent despite his initial reluctance and belief that Spain couldn't defeat the English. He arranged his 130 ships, far fewer than the originally planned 500, in a tight defensive crescent. The English had hoped their long-range guns would allow them to harass the Spanish from a safe distance. That proved an illusion. Only 2 Spanish ships were lost in the opening clash. One sunk in a collision, the other destroyed by an onboard explosion, dooming its soldiers to a watery grave. 3 days later, another engagement brought no decisive outcome. 2 days after that, the English suffered a third demoralizing encounter. The slow-moving Armada continued up the Channel, aiming to rendezvous with the invasion forces from the Netherlands. The Spanish sought to grapple and board English ships for hand-to-hand combat, but England's newer, nimbler ships made this near impossible. As they advanced, they uncovered a fatal flaw in Philip's grand strategy, one that would later frustrate Napoleon and Hitler as well. Somerset explains, "The grim truth was, it was not possible for Spain's barges to leave the havens where they were moored. The general, on the ground, had made it clear that favorable wind and weather were required to risk a channel crossing, and those conditions never arrived. Furthermore, the shallow waters off the Flemish coast meant the Armada had to remain at least 12 miles offshore, unable to protect the transport barges until they were already at sea. This left them exposed to the highly mobile flyboats of the Dutch Navy." Attempting to hide his plans from the Dutch, the Spanish general had kept his troops inland, expecting 6 days' notice before the rendezvous. That notice never came. When the soldiers arrived at the beaches of Dunkirk, the Armada was nowhere in sight. It had already sailed past the point of rendezvous. Anchored while awaiting the army, the Spanish ships became easy targets. On the second night, the English sent burning fire ships, into the anchored fleet. Somerset writes, "The ruse worked. At the sight of the approaching fire ships, the whole sea glittering and shining with the flame thereof, the Spaniards were thrown into confusion, fearing that the vessels were packed with explosives. In panic, they cut their cables and scrambled out to sea." With the Spanish fleet scattered, the English gained numerical superiority and began a relentless chase through the Channel. Combining superior maneuverability and firepower, the English captains discovered they could sail close enough to punch holes in the Spanish hulls, yet remain out of reach of grappling hooks. The two fleets came so close that English sailors could hear Spanish taunts calling them Lutheran chickens and daring them to fight fair. There was no choice but to accept their losses and head home in disgrace. Historian Ben Jonson tells us that, with insufficient supplies, together with the onset of the harsh autumnal British weather, the omens were not good for the Spanish. Fresh water and food quickly disappeared, and as the Armada rounded the north of Scotland in mid-September, it sailed into one of the worst storms to hit the coast in years. Without anchor cables, the Spanish ships were unable to take shelter from the storms, and as a consequence, many were dashed into rocks with great loss of life. The ships that survived the storm headed for what would have been a friendly Catholic Ireland in order to resupply for their journey home to Spain. Taking shelter in what is now called Armada Bay, just south of Galloway, the starving Spanish sailors went ashore to experience that famous Irish hospitality. Immigration control was apparently short and swift, with all who went ashore attacked and killed. When the tattered Armada eventually returned to Spain, it had lost half its ships and 3/4 of its men. Over 20,000 Spanish sailors and soldiers had been killed. On the other side, the English lost no ships and only 100 men in battle. Buoyed by the victory, Elizabeth went out to inspect the troops bound for retaking of the Netherlands on August 8th. She wore a silver breastplate over her white velvet dress. With a truncheon in her hand, she told the assembled troops that we have been persuaded by some that are careful of our safety to take heed of how we commit oneself to armed multitudes for fear of treachery. But I assure you, I do not desire to live in distrust by faithful and loving people. Let tyrants fear. I have always so behaved myself that under God I have placed by chiefest strength and safeguard in the loyal hearts and goodwill of all my subjects. I am come amongst you, not for my recreation, but being resolved in the midst and the heat of battle, to live or die amongst you all, to lay down for my God and for my kingdom and for my people, my honor and my blood. I know I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and the stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. I think foul scorn that Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm. She had been drawn into a war she did not seek, against a force far greater than her own. But instead of retreating, Elizabeth rallied her nation to victory. Her triumph over the invincible Armada marked the end of Spain's unchallenged supremacy and the beginning of England's rise to global empire. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or contacting EmpiresPod on Bluesky. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.